Anyone else grow up singing that song? No one. Well, a couple of people, okay. Thank you, Kim. Thank you for making it possible to let you guys move that. Thank you. Hopefully you can see why I thought it was important for you all to hear Dero in his own voice this morning. All of my life, I have been learning to be white. Since I was a child, I have taken in lessons, some explicit, though most not, about how to be white. It has only been as an adult that I have been learning what it means to be white, to see that there is this thing called whiteness, this thing that is different than my British and Irish heritage, and that it isn't solely about the color of my skin, but is instead about everything, the benefits and the burdens that comes with the color of my skin. Things I can readily see, and things I can see sometimes only after they're pointed out to me, and things that I still struggle to see, even when I read about them or am told about them, because some part of me feels defensive and reactive. Each of us here has a story about how race has shaped our lives and our identity. These stories have 1,000,000 tiny chapters, some too short or too small to easily see, some so dramatic we can't ignore them, some so impactful we carry the weight of them for years, and some so insidious that we are ignorant to the fact that these chapters even exist at all. Each of us has a story of how race has made us who we are. One of the benefits of whiteness is rarely, if ever, being asked to tell that story, to examine how race has shaped us. So here is my story, at least a few of the highlights. It is a story of being white and of coming to see my whiteness. A starting point for any such story is the moment of our first awareness of race. That moment when, for the first time, we come to realize humans come in many different colors. And most importantly, that moment we come to know that people often assign meaning and power to those basic human differences. My earliest memory took place in the back seat of my family's car. It's the early 70s. I'm 4 or 5 years old. We are driving the downtown streets of Birmingham, Alabama. My father, seeing a black man on the sidewalk, lowers his window as we pull to a stop sign and yells out, "Hey," followed by the N-word. What I next remember is my mother's fast and furious intake of air. In an instant, she seems to suck all of the oxygen out of the car. I don't understand much, but I understand that something is horribly wrong. It was one of those gut-wrenching moments that seemed to last a lot longer than it actually did. A moment broken only and finally by the man on the street, a man it turns out my father worked with, yelling back, "Hey, honky." A friendly chat ensued between them until the car behind us beeped its horn and my dad and his coworker waved goodbye. Over 40 years later, I still struggle to make sense of that day in the car. There on the streets of Birmingham, just a short space in time and distance from the jail where Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his famous letter a decade before. Just a few short years removed from fire hoses and police dogs being turned on peaceful protesters nearby. Just a few blocks and a few years away from the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 young girls were killed by hatred while sitting in Sunday school. More than 4 decades later, as a son of the American South, I find myself trying to somehow understand that odd exchange of racial epithets my father and his colleague had adopted, if not as terms of endearment, at least as terms of engagement in an uneasy and ongoing negotiation of race, identity, and power. Were it not for my mother's deep gasp that afternoon, for the fear that she conveyed in a single breath, I might have remained oblivious there in the back seat, unaware that anything troubling had just happened. But in that one breath was a lesson that has touched my life in ways I can barely explain. I learned that day that there is danger in discussing race and racism, and I learned that sometimes it is safer not to talk about it at all. As a child, what little I knew of the civil rights era led me to think of it as ancient history. What I now know is that I was raised for a time near the epicenter of the movement. I was among the first wave of kids in those early years to attend schools that had only recently been desegregated. Though the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled school segregation unconstitutional in 1954, it took further rulings into the early 70s to force resistant communities, mostly in Alabama, to finally integrate their schools. One strategy used at the time to avoid integration involved the creation of private schools, what were called segregation academies. I suspect the new kindergarten I attended was one of those schools. It had only recently been established by my family's Southern Baptist church. While the motivation may have been to ensure the kids in the church were given a Christian education, the location, the timing, and frankly the history of the Southern Baptist Church, a denomination founded in a split with other Baptists over the Civil War and the question of slavery, all lead to my deep and enduring suspicion. With the emphasis on the word Southern, the history of racism is quite literally written into the name of the religion in which I was raised. In Sunday school, we sang, "Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world." Those troubling lyrics aside, based on what was happening beyond those walls every other day of the week, there is reason to wonder if the pews were packed with people who did not quite believe it. People who somehow didn't believe that they were likewise called to love everyone regardless of their background. Though it would take me decades to realize it, the lesson I was being taught is that there can be a disconnect between our words, our attitudes, and our actions. Looking back on my childhood, I'm mindful of the degree to which racist attitudes were so often conveyed through humor, most often in jokes told within our circle of friends or by members of my extended family. What's funny, after all of this time, is that I don't recall any of the jokes or the punchlines. What I remember was a pattern of demonstrating difference, of pointing to the other, and suggesting in a not-so-subtle way that we were better because we were white. The beauty of using humor to make the point is that it never has to be said so plainly. A knowing laugh is enough to get the message across. As formative as these years were, Alabama is not where I started out. I was born in rural Oklahoma in a tiny town called Colgate. Both sides of my family had come to Oklahoma in the late 19th century with the waves of white pioneers who settled what was then called Indian Territory. There was family lore of our ancestors lining up along the border of this territory, waiting for high noon on the day of a land run, when they could, with thousands of others, claim land on a first come, first served basis, finders, keepers. They paid the U.S. government for the land that they claimed, and per the treaties in effect, that money was passed on to those who had previously held claim to the land. The people of the Choctaw Nation, the indigenous peoples originally of the southeastern United States, who 6 decades earlier had been forcibly removed from their traditional lands along the bitter trail of tears. I never recall that last important detail ever being part of a family conversation. While I lived in Oklahoma only for the first 2 years of my life, the displacement of indigenous peoples was never a part of what we discussed at the dinner table or when I visited later, or while I spent summers on my extended family's farms and ranches. We never heard that the land that had in some cases been in the family for generations had only become available because it was taken by the federal government when smaller tracts of land were doled out to the Choctaws on an individual basis, so that the rest could be sold off for a discounted price to white settlers. It was never discussed, even though by all accounts my great-great-grandmother was Choctaw, which makes it all the more ironic that as children, when we would play cowboys and Indians, it was never questioned that it was better to be a cowboy. I suppose I and most every other kid around me learned that lesson clearly enough by watching The Lone Ranger and those TV westerns that showed such a predictable pattern of winners and losers. Of course, we could have learned that lesson from our very own family's story, if only the full history had been passed down. If only we had been asked to grapple with what it meant to see ourselves as the good guys and to see the Indians as the bad guys, as savages, as other. If only my family's history had not been whitewashed. If only I had not been taught by sins of omission that to be white is to pick and choose which parts of the story that we tell. Because my family moved around quite a bit while I was growing up, I spent grades 3 through 8 in Dallas, Texas, and then finished out high school in New Hampshire. In Texas, the racial equations were different from those I had known. In my largely white suburban school, my awareness of race expanded as I learned a new set of names: Rodriguez, Garcia, Martinez. Here I became aware that economic differences often go along with perceptions of race. Though everyone was from the same middle-class neighborhood, and everyone lived in similar-sized homes, the Mexican-American kids in my school were uniformly thought of as poor. There was a narrative, again so often performed with humor, that belittled Mexican people by questioning their immigration status, even though the land where we all lived had actually once been Mexico, and some of these kids' families had lived in the region for generations before we gringos had arrived. The implication of our ignorance was that white people were entitled to the land and that people of Mexican heritage were the interlopers. When my family moved to New Hampshire, I was suddenly in an almost all-white high school. Now my classmates' names were Bouchard, Levasseur, and Lemieux. The students in my school were overwhelmingly from French-Canadian and Catholic backgrounds, and as a Southern WASP, I stood out. From that experience, I learned that even in a seemingly homogeneous racial environment, there seems to be something in the human psyche bent on drawing distinctions between people. We were all white, but there was still a competition for status. When I went off to university, I chose to attend Oberlin College in Ohio, a bastion of liberalism that had been on the progressive end of things since the 1830s, when it was the first school to admit women or black people. The school and the town had been an important stop on the Underground Railroad. As a newly out queer person who thrived in Oberlin's progressive atmosphere, that history meant a great deal to me. It was there that I first began to study sociology and philosophy and began to be confronted by theories of race and racism. It was there at 19 that I first encountered the work of Audre Lorde, the black queer feminist writer who upended so much of my thinking. But what I most readily remember about whiteness from my short time there came from a friend, a black woman, who in a late-night rump session told me that I still had a lot to learn. I don't remember specifically what sparked her comment, but she was right. Her pointed comment was an important milestone on the path to raising my consciousness about racism. I am grateful that there have been many such moments along the way. Like years ago when I was with a friend and being followed through a department store by a guard who kept looking at him because he is black. Like last summer, my being repeatedly followed by department store guards in Mexico because I am white. like being in Kenya a couple of years ago and having people react with surprise at seeing such a pale and pasty person, with kids calling out Mzungu, the Bantu word to describe white people. It can be a term of affection or an insult. Or like being ordained by Arlington Street Church, whose endowment, which helped to pay my salary for almost 10 years, is surely tainted with money given by wealthy Bostonians in the 18th and 19th centuries who profited off of the slave trade. A historic Unitarian church that in 1842 essentially ousted William Ellery Channing, the father of American Unitarianism, and their minister for almost 40 years, when he asked the board for permission to host the funeral of a colleague who was a prominent opponent of slavery. Now, I have shared these few highlights from my own complicated story, and there are so many others, but not enough time, because I believe these stories need to be told. And I've shared my story in hopes of calling you to reflect on your own, to see the ways that race and racism have been written into your life, and even to see the ways that your life has been racialized. I say that in the belief that race is a social construct. I say that with an awareness that race so often intersects in complicated ways with class and gender and other dimensions of who we are. And I say that recognizing that race continues to hold a central and often unspoken place in determining how power and resources are distributed in our society. I've shared my story because you need to know that I have spent much of my life trying to dismantle racism, including that which I carry within myself. For all the work I have done, I am not done with my work. I know I will spend the rest of my life guarding against bias in my thoughts and my actions, and needing to notice the prejudice that impedes racial justice. Now, I realize so much of the experience I've shared with you is American, but these same dynamics, though sometimes different in their details, are alive in Canadian society too. We need only look to the disparities in the criminal justice and social welfare systems to find evidence that contradicts some of our most beloved national myths of fairness and equality. This is why the Unitarian Universalist ministers of Canada are putting forward to our congregations a call to take up the work of racial justice anew. A call to sever the roots of racism that entangle our lives in so many unwelcome ways. If we are ever to get at those roots within us and our congregations and in our society, I have come to believe that there is little progress to be made without first engaging the question, of what it means to be white. I say this because all too often those of us who are white spend so much of our time unconsciously unaware of the implications of our own racial identity, oblivious to the ways in which whiteness shapes so much of how our society is structured. The personal story I've shared with you today can be told in many different ways. I could tell the story of my life, and almost always have, without needing to include any of the messy details I lifted up to say this morning. Such are the benefits of whiteness, that I can tell my story without having to engage questions of race and racism points to one of the greatest privileges of whiteness itself. White people frequently fail to see about ourselves what is so patently and painfully obvious to non-white people. The great novelist Toni Morrison speaks of whiteness through the metaphor of a goldfish bowl, with whiteness being the bowl itself, the seemingly invisible container that holds together our ways of thinking without our even being aware of its presence. It just is. It's normal. So much so that the container we swim in is simply taken for granted. And too often, as a result, the meaning of white identity is left unexamined and unchallenged, as though racism is a problem that belongs only to people of color, as though white isn't a color. Woven into the story of race has always been the story of a struggle for power over others. This has been especially true in the history of whiteness, which didn't even emerge as a concept until the end of the 17th century. Before then, people were primarily known by where they had come from. But when and where people have had the ability to claim a white identity, whiteness has often brought with it higher social status and greater economic power. So much of that power has been used to build a system that rewards and reinforces whiteness, often in completely unconscious ways. So the pressing question for our time is, what then do we do with that system? I believe we need to get to work to find our place in that system, to get to work tearing it down, to take down those walls of division. To do so means facing up to our personal and our shared history, figuring out where we are situated in the structures of racism, and then devoting ourselves to dismantling those systems from the inside out. If we are serious about working toward racial justice, we have to start somewhere, and as is so often the case, that somewhere is with ourselves. This is especially true for those of us who are white. We have an obligation to examine our own privilege and to challenge the notion of whiteness as the invisible norm. As citizens of the 21st century, whether we like it or not, we are enmeshed in systems of oppression that perpetuate injustices that are often contrary to the highest aspirations of our faith. None of us likes to see this, but the difficult truth is that the shape of our lives may not match the deepest hopes of our hearts. Fortunately, there is a way out. As the Laguna Pueblo writer Leslie Marmonsuco says, the only thing that can beat a story is another story. And so it falls to us to determine as best we can the part that is ours to play in that unfolding new story. May we use our power, may you use your power to bend the plot of that story toward more love and more justice. Amen.